Hello, BookTube. It's Ros. It's a beautiful, sunny summer's evening here in Brighton, and it's not quite the end of August yet. But I'm going to do a bit of a wrap up for the reading I've done for Women in Translation Month, so that when I come to my end of the month Delights and Discoveries wrap up, I'm not overwhelmed by wanting to say so much, because Women in Translation is one of the things that I'm reading around this month, and it's such a rich theme that it would steal too much, take too much time to do it justice. So I'm a strong supporter, I guess, of the concept of Women in Translation Month, because in the Anglophone world, certainly, we don't read enough. What's enough? But you know what I mean? We don't do justice to literature that's written in other languages. Not enough stuff gets translated into English for us to read, and that's presumably because publishers don't think there's the market for it. But also, interestingly, you are much less likely to get translated if you're a woman writer in another language into English than if you're a man. So, you know, Women in Translation Month, from my perspective, is a jolly good thing, and it really plays into my enthusiasms, my kind of reading, and the sort of scallywandling that I like to do. I've read, or am reading, 6 things this month for that are all by women in translation, and 2 of those are kind of still on the go. One is the play that I'm reading with Tilly of Tilly's Shelf for our Discussing Drama series, and that's called Saying Yes by Griselda Gambaro. What a great name that is, Griselda Gambaro. Wow. She's an Argentinian playwright, and she wrote it, she's still alive, but she wrote this in the 1970s, so it's not new. We will do a whole video just about that in conversation with each other, so I will leave that one there. We'll shelve that one. The other one that I've started and not yet finished, because I'm relishing it gradually, is this, Chandelier by Clarice Lispector. Now, if you watch this channel regularly, you will know that I have a bit of a Lispector thing. I'm like a fangirl for Clarice, I think. And this book is her second novel, and she wrote it in 1946 it came out. This translation is a nice kind of quite up-to-date translation by Magdalena Edwards and Benjamin Moser, and it's the 5th Lispector novel that I've read, and each one I read, I think to myself, can the next one be as wonderful and peculiar and extraordinary as the last? And each time I find, yes, it can. I've said before that she is not a writer for the faint-hearted, okay, and she's not a writer for you if what you want is plot. You know, her books are really all about the language, and sort of plot and characterization are a bit incidental. Well, no, characterization is there, but it's not kind of straightforward. I'm going to read you the first couple of sentences from Chandelier, because I think they will give you a good guide of whether you would want to pick up a Lispector book. Okay. She'd be flowing all her life, but what had dominated her edges and attracted them towards the centre, what had illuminated her against the world and given her intimate power, was the secret. She'd never know how to think of it in clear terms, afraid to invade and dissolve its image, yet it had formed in her interior a far-off and living nucleus and had never lost the magic. It sustained her in her unsolvable vagueness, like this single reality that for her should always be the lost one. There you go. That's how it starts. And where it goes immediately after that is that the 2 of them, the narrator and her brother, are leaning over a bridge, and there has been there's a drowned man. Which sounds like kind of, plot. But actually then we hear nothing more. I've read another like 60 pages. heard nothing more yet about the drowned man. So you see what I mean? What I think about Lispector, why I think I love her writing so much, is because sometimes when people write very sort of language-based, highly stylized, full of ideas, full of illusions sort of writing, it's a bit of, look at me, how clever I am. You know, it's kind of like showing off. Sometimes it's really good fun to read, but you know what I mean. You know, when you think, oh gosh, there you go again, you know, showing how you can polish your sentence and, you know, impress us with your cleverness. With Lispector, what it feels like is that when you read her work, you are kind of, she's opening the door into her extraordinary intellect and her slightly disturbed personality. And it's just honest like that. You can tell. I love her. I love her. Lispector books are great to read with someone else that's a similarly kind of interested, sensitive, reflective reader. And happily, I'm reading this one with Alan of Big Hard Books and Classics, and we've read a few Lispectors together, and it really helps, I have to say. That's enough of that one. Another of the novels that I've read this month, I was very, very glad to have a buddy to read it with, because it's another South American woman novelist who's in the sort of the fascinating but weird zone, I suppose. So the book was Nervous System by Lina Meruane. I'm not sure how she pronounces her surname. She's Chilean novelist. And she, you know, born and grew up in Chile, but I think some of her family are Italian, so I have a feeling it's an Italian. Anyway, forget that. Unlike Lispector, this is bang up to date. It was published in Spanish in 2018, and the translation I'm reading came out in, I think, March of this year, so very new. And I'm reading it with Sina of Beating Around the Books, and thank heaven I got to read it with her, because that really kind of helped me through what is a strange and at times almost off-putting story, but a very worthwhile one. It's an awful lot of it is about kind of physical ailments, and we kind of follow a main character, but the style all the way through is quite, there's a sort of certain distance and coolness about it, so that you don't kind of become terribly attached to that main character, even though you find out a lot about her. She's almost quite unlikable, I suppose, you know, which is fine. I'm fine with an unlikable, but yeah. What Sina and I concluded, and this is why I was really glad to kind of be sharing this with her, was that it feels like that what the author is doing is she's writing about trauma. She's writing about the trauma of growing up or living under a dictatorship, as you know, we know Chile was. She's writing about the trauma of losing a parent when you're a child. She's writing about attempting to forge a new life as a migrant in another country and not pulling that off, or the difficulties that kind of gives you, all those things, and looking almost at how they then can express themselves physically in the body. So hence all the sort of stuff about physical ailments and so on. It's also got space and astrophysics, and there's a lot in there. It was translated by Megan McDowell, and I have to say, what a tremendous translation. I really what a challenge it must have been, and I really admired this as a work of translation. It's because it's a very metaphorical book, but also it's a book that literally plays with words, and so taking wordplay in one language and translating it into another is effectively is quite an achievement. I think, you know, the language was the most enjoyable aspect of this book, and you know, when you're reading, I hope you know when you're reading something, this experience, you know, when you read like a sentence or a paragraph and you have to just stop and reread it and admire it and roll it around your head a little. It's that kind of book. And I think that's why Sina gave it like a kind of 5-star rating. It was I decided this was a 4-star book for me because I think for the rather shallow reason that I find it a bit tiresome when people go on about their ill health a lot, and not that I'm not empathetic about, you know, or feel like people, you know, real life ill health, if you know what I mean. But I think I was kind of brought up in some sort of cult home where, you know, you didn't go on about that stuff, and interestingly, so was the main character in this book, because her parents were doctors, so I think that maybe made me undervalue it. I have that feeling that it may be one of those books, you know, when you come to the end of the year and you look back on the things that you've read, some books have grown and some have shrunk, and I think this one may be a grower. We shall see. There we go. I was very glad to read it. Having read that, I needed to read something more straightforward, okay, and I think I needed something a bit more warm-hearted, because I say it's in many ways quite a cold book. And the thing that I read was my third women in translation novel, and that was The Last Train to Istanbul by Ayşe Kulin. She's a Turkish author. It was came out in 2002 in Turkey. She's a bestseller there. It was another of her bestsellers. It's been translated into 22 languages, I think, and the English translation was published in 2006, and the translator was John Baker. How to describe this book? This is relatively, yes, straightforward, heartwarming historical fiction. It's got a bit of romance, it's got a bit of politics, it's got a bit of kind of family saga-y kind of stuff. But at the heart of it is it's one of those historical fiction books where an author has latched onto a really interesting little kind of side avenue in history and turns that into the theme of their novel. And what this was and I had vaguely heard this but didn't really know, in the Second World War, Turkish diplomats in Europe chose to use the fact that they were a neutral country and that they could give Turkish passports to Turkish Jews that had sort of Turkish connections, and also some other Jews that weren't strictly speaking Turkish, but where they thought they could kind of get away with claiming they were Turkish, and then used that to basically get them out of occupied France and so on, take them to either to Turkey or to somewhere from where they could embark to go to Palestine. So quite a admirable little sort of hopeful story within the horribleness of the Holocaust. I think, and I don't know this, but I wonder if Kulin has a little message there for the current Turkish regime, in that she really makes the point that Jews had been welcomed into Turkey by the Ottomans, like in 1492, when people were like thrown out of other parts of Europe, particularly Spain, that they were taken in, welcomed into what was in the Ottoman Empire, and that still in the Second World War there were Turkish people who were upholding that kind of cultural and religious diversity within Turkey, and that is something that is becoming less and less true today, and I wonder if that was part of her message. But essentially, it's just like an enjoyable story, good to read. What let it down for me, I think, was the translation. I'm pretty sure that this was a good kind of like page turner, with like not, you know, highfalutin language or whatever, but you know, I'm sure it flowed in Turkish. In the English translation, it was a bit wooden at times, and my impression was that it was down to the translation. I'm certainly very glad that I read it. Now, my last two women in translation choices were the sort of my less well, not novels. Yeah. The genre that's not novels. What nonsense are you talking, Ros? It'll make sense when I say. And interestingly, they were perhaps the highlights of my reading. So I'll explain. One was I'm trying each month at the moment to read a graphic novel, and I was looking for one in translation, and a load of people said to me when I was, when I was trying to think of a graphic novel by a woman in translation that I could read, they said, oh, you must do Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. And the trouble was, I'd already read Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. It's her memoir in graphic novel form, and it is absolutely brilliant. But I went to my local library to have a hunt to see what I could find, and I found this also by her, which is almost like a coda to Persepolis, because what it is a book, a graphic novel about the pretext story is that a youngish Marjane, sort of young adult, I suppose, goes for a meal at her grandmother's house, and at the end of the meal, the men are all packed off to have a nap, and the women all clear up, and then the Marjane makes tea, and they all sit down with tea and they talk, and this is all like a book of their conversation. And what do this group of women, her grandmother, her mother, her aunties, their friends, you know, these older Iranian women, what do they talk about? They talk about their love lives. That's what they talk about. Their relationships and their sex lives. And it's like kind of Sex in the City in Iran with Iranian aunties, as it were. It was just a gem of a book, absolutely brilliant. I loved it to pieces. Satrapi's style is very kind of bold, black and white images. It looks quick, but actually it's clever. It's very sort of strong expressions. It gives you a feeling of a very effective feeling of atmosphere and of people's personalities and emotions. I highly recommend Persepolis, and I also very much recommend this. It's yeah, great stuff. And just kind of know what you expect, I suppose. Oh, now, because this is Women Translation Month, I should mention the translator. So, Satrapi came out in, although she's Iranian, she now lives in France. It came out in France in French in 2003, but the translation was by Anjali Singh, and that came out in 2006, translation into English. Now, my final women translation choice couldn't be more different, really, but was in its way equally the most tremendous book. And probably, I suspect it will be my top book of the month, whether in translation or not. And that was Chernobyl Prayer by Svetlana Alexievich. Now, she got the Nobel Prize for Literature in about 2015, was it? Now, the Nobel Prize committee have made some pretty random decisions in the last few years, but I think this was a really worthy one in giving her that prize, and it has led to more of her books being translated into English, which is, you know, very much to all our benefit. This is the first thing by her I've read, and I was so glad to read it. You can tell from the name, Chernobyl Prayer, that it's about the Chernobyl disaster, the nuclear power station explosion fire that caused a sort of radioactive cloud to spread across Europe, and it has sort of turned a chunk of the Ukraine and Belarus into a kind of a no-go zone. It's ruined for centuries to come. At the time that it happened, which was, what year was it? 1986? Is that right? Yeah, 1986. At that time, the author, Svetlana Alexievich, was a journalist in Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus, or at that time, of course, it was still the Soviet Union, but it was the capital of Soviet Belarusia. And so she was very close to where this happened, and she spent the next, and it's really worth knowing that although Chernobyl is in the Ukraine, the country that was most devastated, most affected by the sort of aftermath of this disaster was Belarus. She spent the next 10 years talking to people, interviewing people about the disaster and its aftermath, and that became this book. So this is a book of oral history. It's not a book that looks to explain why the disaster happened, how it happened. It doesn't go into that at all. It's not a book that kind of tells you what happened in any kind of linear fashion. It's a book that is just about, not just, wonderfully about how that affected people's lives. She is just as interested in the, peasant grandmother who's now, snuck back to live in her house and grow her vegetables, even though, they were all evacuated and they're not meant to live there, and there's no power and there's no water and there's no, but she's just as interested in that person, or the cleanup crew, or the firefighter's wife, as she is in the scientists, or the district secretary of the communist apparatchiks, Soviet apparatchiks of the time. She brings all those voices together, and she does it in a way that is like oral history. Sounds like it would be quite parochial, and she genuinely is using their voices, but somehow the way she puts this together, it's the selection and the juxtaposition that is her skill, I guess, and what makes this a magnificent piece of writing. And at times it almost like poetry. Yeah, I've rarely been so impressed by a work of non-fiction that is not not an academic work, but a work for the general reader. But I think I must stop before I run out of superlatives for this book. So there we go. Oh, the translators. I've got to credit the translators, haven't they? So she published this in 1997 in Russian. It wasn't translated until 2013. It was translated by Anna Gunin and Tate, and that came out, did I say 2013? That came out in 2016. So yeah, it took a long time to get translated, which is very much, I guess, at the heart of why we want and need Women in Translation Month. Now, I would love to hear if you've read any of these books, but almost even more, I would love to hear what you've read for Women in Translation Month. What have been the goodies? What are the ones that you would recommend that I should stock up to read in the future? Not just in Women in Translation Month, in any month. So do share.